Hi students, I'm going to go ahead and go over the lesson from today about forces between liquids and the sticky molecules concept that you were working on in the gizmo. So first, just a little reflection on which is a liquid, just to get you thinking about liquids. If you're choosing A and F, you would be correct. And reminding you of some of the things that you have learned in your previous classes about liquids. I know you've studied them before. They have a definite volume and a definite shape. They have a definite volume and not definite shape or indefinite shape. That means they take the shape of their container. We also say they're fluid, which means they're moving constantly and there's enough space between the particles that they can move past each other to flow. So liquids can flow. Gases can actually flow too. The concept of being fluid just means that they need to be moving and they need to have enough space between them that they can pass by one another. They have relatively high density, which means they're pretty close together, only a little bit of space between them so they can move. You are not able to compress them. The particles are very tightly packed. If you've ever tried to push into a glass of water, you'll see that the water will escape instead of squish down. And they diffuse readily due to their normal motion that they have. Looking at this picture, this will help to illustrate the diffusion concept. So if you look at the picture on the left, if you take some water and you add to it some food coloring like this green dye, zooming in, you can see what the water molecules look like. And then as diffusion occurs over time, they will begin to mix. And the reason why they're going to begin to mix is because the particles have energy. They have their natural motion energy in them by the fact that they are a liquid. They have the ability to move past one another, and they will continue to move past one another. Now, if you wanted to speed up that motion, increase the kinetic energy, make the particles move faster yet, you could either stir them or heat them or agitate, mix them in some way, and that would speed up the process of them mixing and diffusing until they are totally and completely mixed. So what are these attractive forces between the liquids? We've explored this a little bit. They have a name. They're actually called intermolecular forces. Inter means between. So intermolecular means between molecules. So when you look at my picture here, the force between the two HCl molecules is the intermolecular force that makes them stick to each other. So the forces that hold the molecules together are called intermolecular forces. Now, I don't want you to confuse this with the bonds inside the molecule. Those forces are called intramolecular. Intra means within. So intramolecular forces, bonds are relatively strong. But today we're talking about the forces between two molecules, which are called between the molecules, molecular. So whether or not they stick depends upon the forces of attraction between them. So as you were exploring in the gizmo or in the virtual lab, cohesion is water sticking to water. So cohesion is the attraction between the neighboring molecules of a substance. So if the molecules stick to themselves, that is cohesion. And that causes the water to form a droplet, a little droplet. So if you look in my picture here at the bottom picture, the big blue circle with the valence electrons, those dots, that represents oxygen, the big blue circle. And the little red ones represent hydrogen. Notice hydrogen covalently bonded to oxygen. But then there's a force of attraction that sticks one water molecule to the ones nearby. And you'll notice that the positive end, where the hydrogens are, where the red part is attracted to the negative end of a neighboring molecule. They stick to each other. These are what we're talking about, those intermolecular forces. Not the bonds in the molecule, but the stickiness of one molecule to another. Now, do all these liquids have the same kinds of stickiness or intermolecular forces? And the answer to that is no, not all liquids do have the same attractiveness. It depends upon their polarity. The molecule itself can have a bond in it, like the bond between oxygen and hydrogen in this picture on the left. Hydrogen in this picture is the little white circle, and oxygen in this picture is the red circle. And that's because the radius of oxygen is larger, so they made it a larger circle. But you'll notice, due to their differences in pull for electrons, oxygen has a higher electronegativity. Hydrogen has a lower electronegativity. And if you want to check that out on the periodic table, you just look those two up and you'll see that oxygen is farther up and to the right on the periodic table, which lets you know that it has a greater pull or electronegativity for the electrons in a bond. Now, the pull for electrons in a bond can affect the polarity of the molecule overall. So when an oxygen and a hydrogen bond, and another hydrogen is also joined and bonded to the oxygen, the water molecule itself unequally shares or pulls the electrons to a different part of the molecule. So you'll notice that the oxygen has greater pull, so the oxygen holds the electrons more closely to itself, whereas the hydrogens do not have the electrons as close, therefore setting up a polarity, a positive and negative end to the molecule. The one on the right, the example of hydrogen bonded to hydrogen, H2, does not have that same polarity because these two atoms have equal pull for electrons. Therefore, they hold them right in between them, which means that the bond is nonpolar. It does not set up a positive and a negative end. It's more of a neutral particle when it's done forming a molecule, which we call nonpolar. If you looked at an example and used animals to represent these, sometimes we do a comic strip in class called Polar Bears and Penguins. So in the top example, across the top, you've got two polar bears represented by chlorine atoms. Cl2 would be the molecule, and they are bonded and they have equal attraction for their electrons. Therefore, they hold them right in the middle. So this molecule on the top with two polar bears is a nonpolar molecule. Same thing with H2. It's represented by penguins. These two penguins have the same exact pull for electrons, H2, and therefore they bond and they form a nonpolar molecule. Now, if you looked at the molecule formed in the bottom example, though, by H and Cl, chlorine being a polar bear having a greater pull for electrons, holds those two electrons, represented by the ice cream scoops, closer to itself, thus setting up a negative end and a positive end. So if you were to consider HI, would you consider that one polar or nonpolar? And then, how would you represent it as a comic strip? Two polar bears, two penguins, one of each? The best way to represent it would be very similar to the one at the bottom here, H and Cl. Remember, iodine is on the same family in the periodic table, so it has a bigger electronegativity than hydrogen. Therefore, it will hold the electrons more closely, setting up a polar molecule represented by one of each animal. Little question for thought here as we enter the next part of our notes. The reason why is what is called surface tension. Surface tension is the force at the top of the liquid that holds it together. And cohesion, or the attraction of neighboring molecules, is responsible for this. This is what causes a droplet of water to be the smallest possible thing it can be, which is a little sphere or circle. The more attraction it has, the higher its surface tension will be. And water tends to have a very high surface tension, and that's due to a very strong intermolecular forces, including a specialized one called hydrogen bonding. That is very uncommon, but water has it. And that is the reason why water droplets typically make a spherical shape. Because remember, all of these particles of water, all of these molecules of water, I should say, are attracting to each other. These little arrows represent the pull or the force or the vector to represent the force of attraction between each neighboring molecule that makes them hold each other tightly. And even in the middle, cohesion is very strong, especially with these intermolecular forces that water has. You may have done this experiment before as a younger child, where you took a plant like cabbage or celery and watched colored water travel. That is representing what is called capillary action. This is where the surface of the liquid attracts to something other than its own molecules. In this case, it would be a solid or the wall of the tubes that allow the plant to bring fluid in, or a straw, or even the way that it travels up a plant from its roots all the way to its leaves where photosynthesis occurs. Remember, plants have little vessels called xylem and phloem that are lined with cellulose or wood, and that is what it is sticking to. So adhesion allows for capillarity. Adhesion is the ability of a liquid to stick to something else if it happens to be sticky or polar and the substance is polar. This is also what causes a meniscus. When you're in the lab and you're reading from a graduated cylinder, you'll notice that a meniscus forms. Let me show you what I mean by the meniscus. Here in this picture you see I'm describing adhesion and cohesion. Again, cohesion is two molecules of the same kind attaching or attracting due to their positive and negative ends. Adhesion being the way that this molecule of water or another liquid can stick to a wall or a surface, such as a straw or the tubes in a plant or the sides of a graduated cylinder represented by A here. You see how it forms a curve? That's what I mean by the meniscus. So in order for capillary action to occur, you need both. Whenever something travels up a tube or up a column or up through a plant, you need both adhesion and cohesion. The reason why this meniscus effect occurs is because glass is polar, and so water being polar, it sticks to the sides and it sticks to itself. So in this picture here, you see the arrows representing how water sticks to the sides or wall of the tube or glass graduated cylinder. In the bottom here, you see that water, of course, sticks to itself as well, and this causes it to pull up on the sides of the tube. And by the way, when you're in the lab, you always read the bottom of the meniscus. The U at the bottom is where you take your reading. And the last bit here I wanted to say is that intermolecular forces can't hold on forever. The force between the particles we've been talking about, in fact, they can be overcome in the case of evaporation and boiling. Anytime the liquid is able to get enough energy to leave its surface and become a vapor, you basically had to break those intermolecular forces. And here are a couple of vocabulary words associated with that. Vaporization means changing into a gas. Evaporation is where something turns into a gas from the surface of the liquid. And boiling is when the liquid changes to bubbles or vapor all over the liquid at its boiling point. So these are examples of times when the intermolecular forces let go because the energy that's in those particles is enough to break those forces so the particles can become part of the gas phase. And that, my friends, will lead us into other concepts as we go, maybe later talking about things like freezing and melting and changes to a solid as well. That's it for now. Talk to you again soon.